There's a really nice book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. It's a very controversial theory that he spells out about the origin of consciousness, which is almost impossible to verify or refute, but it's kind of interesting and compelling. And what he basically says there is there was a time in the evolution of modern humans in which our minds weren't as they are now, but were in two parts, bicameral, having two chambers, he says. And at one time during our history, rather than having this sense that we are thinking our own thoughts and that we kind of have an internal dialogue, interesting article in this month's New Scientist about internal dialogues, by the way, instead of having this internal dialogue or this internal monologue that we're constantly playing over to ourselves, there was a time when these two chambers, as he says, the bicameral mind, was separate. So one chamber would talk to the other about, giving feedback about the world, or so you would hear thoughts. You wouldn't talk to yourself. You would hear thoughts coming from elsewhere, and he kind of evidences this by looking at literature up to kind of Homer, ancient Greeks, and how the way that is written, there's no sense of any internal dialogue or internal monologue in that literature. There was descriptions of scenes, or there was the voices of the gods. And what he suggests there is that bicameral mind, that sense of hearing voices, normal cognitive processing for that time was the hearing of our own voices as if they were coming from elsewhere. He says that that's at some point over the last few thousand years, that's fused, so we no longer have a bicameral mind. We don't hear voices from elsewhere. Our voices are ourselves. The voices that we hear in our heads all the time are ourselves. Our internal monologue is ourself, and that is modern consciousness. Now, that's a long introduction to what I'm thinking of about the voices of the gods, because I've watched quite a few YouTube videos recently about hearing voices, particularly the voices of Jesus or the voice of God, the voice of spirits, of angels. There's something really interesting to that about me, for me at least, because obviously when people say that these days, it tends to be associated with schizophrenia or some other kind of mental disorder, and I know there are particular pathological conditions which can seem to produce that, but it's also used to talk about kind of religious experience, or the descriptions of religious experience. I'm just wondering if I can build this bicameral mind idea into that, because I think if Julian Jaynes's idea was solid, let's just say, then there's two ways of explaining the voice of God in those terms. One of which that it's simply a throwback. Some of us haven't evolved from a bicameral state to a unicameral state. Instead of hearing those voices that are really ourselves, we hear them as if they're gods. Not quite to the extent that we're schizophrenic about it, but we do get the sense that a voice coming from elsewhere. We feel kind of possessed or something, I guess, or inhabited by a spirit that's talking to us, that kind of thing. That's one way of looking at it. It's a kind of throwback. But another way of looking at it might be as a kind of throw forward, or a reaching forward. Is there a way of considering this hearing of the voice of God as being something that we're in the process of evolving into? Does it make sense to think that rather than those people who are claiming to hear the voices of God, rather than them being kind of atavistic Neanderthals who haven't developed modern consciousness, that these are actually the forerunners of a kind of consciousness yet to come, in which we do indeed hear the voice of God for a while, and then perhaps ultimately that voice becomes integrated into us. But rather than it being the voice of I guess what I'm looking for is rather because of the internal voice, the bicameral mind that evolves into the unicameral mind that Julian Jaynes talks about, this voice that represents modern consciousness. That voice tends to be quite individual. When we hear our voices ourselves, when we all have internal dialogues, internal monologues, they're pretty singular. They're individual people. It's our individual voice, however compressed it might be. It's a kind of individual voice that we're hearing, representing something that feels like a human. But maybe if there's a way of evolving a different kind of internal voice, of which people who are currently hearing religious voices are the forerunners, that voice wouldn't be the voice of an individual human. That would be the voice, not the voice of the Mistrons, that would be the voice of either the collective, or the voice of a society, or the voice of the ecological systems of the planet. Maybe even a kind of a voice that speaks for the well-being of a... I'm not even sure what well-being means in this context, but that speaks on behalf of a much larger system of organisation than the individual human biological body. You know, because my voice speaks for my biological body, kind of, and what its aspirations and ambitions and aims are. But if I was going to have a voice of God, in inverted commas, it would be a voice that speaks for much larger areas of organisation, much larger systems existing over eons of time, or perhaps eternity, across not just this few cubic feet of space that I occupy, but for all space, and would represent much more complicated systems than, as I say, the biochemical systems of my body. So is there a sense in which, sorry, I do feel like rambled, I apologise for that, is there a way that we can think of the development of a new bicameral mind, and we're just starting to hear the whisperings of a new God? Not the old God that produced, that Homer kind of talks about in his mates, that leads Julian Jaynes to think about the evolution of this consciousness in that bicameral mind to this unitary mind, but a new kind of bicameral mind forming, in which we're starting to hear the whisperings of the cosmos, if I can put it in those terms. And I'm getting them wrong a lot. Of course, our hearing is imprecise. We're not evolved perhaps to the state where we can really hear that yet. And of course we're going to mishear it, and we're going to put our interpretations on those mumblings that we're just starting to hear. But maybe that hearing will become clearer over time. And if people are sharing what they're hearing, they can get a sense of collective hearing and collective listening. And then maybe we'll develop a new, not just a new bicameral mind, in which my mind and the mind of God, if I can call it that, are occupying these two chambers, but then you'll get a unicameral mind, the evolution of a new consciousness, in which your consciousness and mine and everybody else's will be blended in that kind of pantheistic way. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't going to go to most pantheism really, but that's just the way it went really. So, origin of consciousness, the origin of omega point consciousness in the tricameral mind.